My name is Javier, and I'm an embalmer at a funeral home in a fairly small town. Due to the nature of my work, I've witnessed many paranormal events. Some have been quite casual and anecdotal, while others have left a mark on me for weeks or even months. But the story I want to tell you goes a step further, and that's why I consider it worth sharing. You see, I don't want to be specific about my place of origin, but let's just say I'm from a Caribbean country where spiritualism and witchcraft are widely practiced religions for both good and bad. Furthermore, being from a rural town, the practice of these religions is much more common. I respect everyone's beliefs as long as they don't harm others, but, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. All this happened in August of last year. I was at the funeral home as usual, preparing the body of a man who had died of cardiac arrest. I take my work very seriously, because for me, it's not just about decorating the dead. For me, it's vitally important to leave them exactly as they were in life, and that's why, if it's not too much trouble for the family or friends, I usually ask for a photo of the person in a happy moment. That way I can leave them just as they remember them. It makes saying goodbye much easier. I know from personal experience. I was finishing preparing the body when the morgue assistant, a new guy I'll call Daniel, came in pushing a gurney with a sheet. A black sheet was covering a body. I asked him why, but he didn't seem to understand. "She's an elderly lady," he said, his voice trembling, as he pushed the stretcher into one of the examination rooms and quickly put it inside. I watched him the whole time, and he seemed quite tense. How to describe it? It was as if he didn't want to be around her for long. He even made a very rude gesture, shaking his hands and body as soon as he closed the examination room. I called him out on it. I told him not to do that she was someone's wife or mother, and that she didn't deserve it to be treated with disgust. But he immediately corrected me. "It's not disgust, Javier. It's fear." "Let's see. Why?" "Well, I don't know if you believe in these things, but that woman was a witch. I'm not going to lie, I didn't really care what the woman was. Why be afraid of her? What she did in life." I asked him about the black cloth again. He answered that the family insisted that they leave her with the cloth and, if possible, cremate her. Daniel was too nervous, and his urgency to leave was quite exasperating. I asked him if the family was still outside, and he said his sister-in-law was probably still in the office. I left the morgue and headed outside the funeral home. There, I found an older woman about to leave. I asked her if she was related to the woman who had just arrived, and she nodded very slowly, looking me up and down. That made me a little uncomfortable because it was as if she was analyzing me with her eyes. I told her that if they wanted, I could prepare her so they could say their goodbyes before the cremation, and she shrugged. "You can do that if you want." "Well, it's more for your sake," I clarified, incredulous at her indifference. "And if you'd like to give me a photograph and the clothes she liked best so I can dress her." "She's already dressed, and we want her just as she is right now. Cremate her with the fabric and with what you have in your hands." The tone in which this woman spoke was firm and very cold. I was surprised to hear that I had something in my hands, and I tried to tell the lady that in the cremation process the deceased cannot carry metal objects with them, but she didn't listen to me. Or rather, she ignored me. I went to the office where the funeral home owner was. I told him what had happened, and he said that as long as it wasn't metal, he could cremate what the family was asking for. He was usually a rather indifferent man, so his answer didn't surprise me. I went back down to the morgue, and as soon as I entered, I noticed that the lady's cabinet was open. I thought Daniel, in his haste, hadn't closed it properly, so I went over to close it. When I was just a few feet away, I heard a voice coming from inside, more of a groan. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I was silent for a moment. But I've been doing this for years, and I remembered that bodies sometimes make sounds. I closed the cabinet and continued with my work. At that moment, there were only two bodies in the morgue, the man, who was almost ready, and her. I was focused, and I like to work in silence. So the only sound that accompanies me is usually the air conditioner. That's why I was a little startled to hear a metallic bang on a door. I thought it was coming from the front door, and I went to open it, but there was no one there. And just then I heard two more bangs, but they were coming from the cabinets. I sighed heavily, realizing that the old lady's spirit was restless. As I said, I've witnessed many paranormal events, and I'm not going to pretend to be skeptical when the evidence is right in front of me. However, one never gets used to it. There's always something inside you that makes you feel afraid, that makes you know you're facing something supernatural and even something dangerous. I took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in my hands, and said to him in the firmest voice I could muster, "I'm coming with you, don't rush, we'll be finished soon." I called Daniel shortly afterward so he could take the man to the chapel where the wake would be held. He was a very beloved man, and many people from the townspeople came to say goodbye that afternoon. I went upstairs for a moment to get a coffee at a cafe where they usually serve soup and something hot to the mourners, and when I came back down to the morgue, the lady's cabinet was open again. I crossed myself, mustered my courage, and went to prepare her. Her cremation would take place around 6 in the evening, since her relatives didn't want to wake. I moved her to a stretcher and then placed her on the work table. You have no idea how scared I was to take the black sheet off her. My imagination conjured up the worst-case scenarios where the old woman jumped off the table and attacked me, or where the body was already mummified. I even thought she might speak to me or something like that. I quickly removed the veil and closed my eyes tightly, but after a few seconds I opened them and returned to reality. It was just the body of a grandmother with a gentle face, a black veil, and a dress of the same color. Her expression was peaceful, and I calmed down considerably. I began preparing her body for cremation, and everything was fine until I saw her hands and remembered what the lady had told me a little while ago. The old woman had her hands folded over her stomach, and I noticed she was holding something. Again, the same fear that had gripped me when I was about to remove her cloak came over me when I thought I should see what she was holding. Although this time, my fear was justified. In her hand, she held what I can only describe as a ball of flesh and hair with 2 small bones sticking out of it. I felt nauseous, and I understood Daniel's feeling. That fear and distrust I felt when moving the stretcher to the morgue. Now I must explain something about the cremation process. Normally, the deceased are cremated with their clothes and may have fabrics, photographs, or other symbolic objects, but under no circumstances should metal or ceramic objects enter the cremation oven. And it was my responsibility to check that mass of flesh and hair to see if it had any metal objects inside. It is needless to say, I didn't want to, and I remembered what Daniel had told me. That woman was a witch, and that thing was a spell. I didn't want to touch it, but I didn't want to burn it either. My situation was quite complicated, and I kept thinking about my options while I prepared the body until it was finally ready. I crossed myself, thinking that what I had decided was the best thing to do, not only for professional reasons, but because if it was true that that woman was a witch, then that was a spell, and it couldn't be good. I grabbed some tweezers and tried to pick up that mass of flesh, but the old woman's hands clung to it tightly. I'd never seen such rigor mortis. Finally, one piece at a time, I managed to tear it apart and throw it in the trash. I never touched it with my hands. I didn't feel comfortable with that thing in the morgue's wastebasket, so I took advantage of having to call Daniel to take it to the crematorium to take out the trash myself. I left the morgue, and I hadn't taken 5 steps when a loud scream made me stumble and fall. I stared incredulously at the door, and I swear on anything you want that I saw a shadow move across the window of the door. I ran like a madman outside the morgue, threw the bag in the trash, and saw Daniel nearby. I begged him to come with me to put the lady in the cabinet because it was a couple of hours until the cremation, and he agreed, though reluctantly. When we went in, I found her in almost the same position, although her hands were slightly different at her sides. I didn't say anything to Daniel. I simply covered her with her black shroud and placed her in the cabinet. I didn't go back into the morgue until the time of the cremation, when they took her away. I was genuinely very curious, and although it wasn't my responsibility, I went over to the crematorium to see if Daniel needed anything. I thought the lady's family would be there, or at least the woman I had spoken to earlier that afternoon, but there was no one there, only Daniel, standing in a corner, anxiously checking his watch. I went in to keep him company, and the burden became lighter for both of us as the minutes ticked by, until finally the time came. No one came to say goodbye, so we carefully moved her inside the oven, and I let Daniel do his job operating it. I didn't know how it worked, so I just watched. I'll never forget what happened next. As soon as the body began to burn, a sharp, uncontrolled scream made us both jump. Daniel immediately turned off the oven and pulled the old woman out. Her mouth was open and his expression had changed. Now he was filled with anger and his eyes were wide open. Daniel begged me to take her pulse, thinking she was still alive, but I assured him she wasn't. I worked with her for an hour, maybe 2. There was no way she was alive. However, he insisted, and I knew that until I proved it to him, he wouldn't continue. Fearfully, I raised my hand and took her pulse in front of him. Although it felt warm, there were no vital signs. Daniel reluctantly put her back in the oven, and as soon as they started cremating her, the screams started again. Daniel didn't know what to do, and he ran out of the crematorium. I didn't have the strength to move my legs, and I heard her screaming with rage for a couple more seconds until there was silence. A few minutes later, the funeral home owner arrived with Daniel and other onlookers from the man's wake. They asked us what was happening, and I couldn't speak. Daniel, for his part, asked if they hadn't heard the screams, but they all just looked at each other, confused. Only Daniel and I witnessed what happened, and few of those present believed us. I went home immediately, and fortunately, my wife believed me and helped me release all the stress of the day. Now, Daniel had to get back to work, and he told me what happened. 2 hours later, the old woman's body had been reduced to ashes, and the woman from that morning returned to look for her. He gathered the ashes and placed them in a rather simple urn, without crosses or any religious symbols. Fortunately, the boss was a witness and saw when the woman, upset, began to ask questions. Where was what she was holding in her hands? Daniel shook his head, not knowing what she was talking about, and the woman flew into a rage, cursing and threatening to attack him. Our boss had to restrain her, call Martin, the security guard, and shortly after the town police. We soon discovered from the police officer who came to our aid that this woman was also a witch, and that the woman we had cremated had no family or friends who could claim her remains. The ashes were stored for weeks at the funeral home, waiting for someone to come forward, to claim them. All that time, the atmosphere grew heavier and gloomier than it already was, and everyone saw silhouettes and shadows out of the corner of their eyes, until the mayor of our town decided to send the remains to a mass grave. All this time I've been wondering what could have provoked such a violent reaction in both women, but it's quite obvious that it was because I took that work of meat from their hands. Something inside me tells me I did the right thing, but at the same time I'm afraid that one day those women will retaliate against me. Besides, I wonder, what were they trying to do? Who were they trying to hurt? I'll never know. Hello, my name is Antonio. I'm a forensic pathologist, and for the last 10 years I've worked in the morgue of a private clinic here in Mexico City, although I prefer not to say which one exactly, to avoid any kind of retaliation. I don't think the clinic's administration would be too happy about ghost stories being told on their premises. I remember it was December because my mentor, Dr. Rebecca, had put up a tiny tree. Christmas in our office. She's always had a pretty cheerful and optimistic attitude, and that helps a lot in a workplace like this. I found that tree funny because it clashed with our usual gloomy surroundings. Anyway, it was a quiet afternoon. Everyone was doing their paperwork when the body of an adult arrived. The assistant peeked out of the office door, alerted us, and I told him to leave it in the autopsy room, not to put it in any cubicle because we were already on our way. This guy went on his way. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of her sneakers on the hallway floor. I knew she was gone, and no more than 2 minutes passed before I heard a very loud cough coming from the autopsy room. Rebecca must have noticed my start because she immediately asked me, "What's wrong? Didn't you ever hear someone cough?" I looked at her and asked if she hadn't noticed that the assistant had already left. She remained calm and just smiled at me, as if to say that yes, she had ears too. Then she stood up, and I followed her into the next room. Having never been inside a morgue, I found it to be a fairly simple place. Imagine a room with a few gurneys and work tables, and at the back, refrigerated cubicles for storing the bodies of the deceased. The layout may vary, but the elements are almost always the same. We walked in, and the body was already on one of the morgue tables, covered with a blanket. We prepared to do our work, and suddenly, I heard another rasping cough. I turned to look at Dr. Rebecca, but she didn't even flinch. She continued reading she reported as if nothing were happening, and for a minute I thought I'd gone mad. Luckily, Rebecca was understanding, and before we started she simply told me, "Stay calm, you're going to see some strange things, but don't panic." I was already quite nervous. I was a rookie at the time and had never encountered anything unusual, so I didn't know what to expect. We approached the body and uncovered it. It was a fairly young man, about 20 years old. He had arrived at the clinic without vital signs, and no family members had come with him. I don't want to get too technical with the terminology or the steps of an autopsy, so I'll just say that we began examining the body, looking for the possible cause of death of that young man. He looked quite healthy, and at first glance there was no reason for someone like him to die. I was examining his left arm, and I was focused on my task when suddenly his hand tightened around my arm. I jumped back, but even then I couldn't free myself from his grip. Rebecca looked at me again, and his calmness was contagious. Slowly I moved my fingers away and placed his arm back in position to continue working, assuming it was just a muscle spasm. A few minutes later, his body jerked violently on the examination table. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, trying not to look frightened as I watched his arms fall to his sides, and even as he made a move to sit up. Rebecca remained in control and gently laid him back down, placed his arms back in position, and carried on as if nothing had happened. I was very tense, for I had never seen such violent and vivid post-mortem spasms, so coherent. Again, nothing seemed to answer why or how this person had died. I proceeded to examine their throat, and suddenly their eyes opened. I was terrified, Not only because of that, but because I clearly saw their gaze directed at me. I've always been a bit of a coward, and I know I can be easily influenced. But this wasn't my own doing. Their eyes met mine, and again I felt them grab my wrist. I froze, and as if it wasn't cold enough in the autopsy room, I felt my blood run cold. Fortunately, I wasn't alone. A few seconds passed before Rebecca, with a calm hand, lowered the young man's eyelids, saying gently, "Stay calm. We're going to find out what happened to you." As I said, at that moment I was quite inexperienced, and I stared at her, unsure if she was speaking to me or the deceased. But when I felt the young man's hand release me from his grasp, I understood that Dr. Rebecca knew far more about this profession than I could have imagined. I stepped back and sat for a few minutes, watching her work with the same calm and good humor that characterized her. I took a deep breath, remembering what she had told me, and returned to my work, understanding that she had seen it all coming, even before entering the autopsy room. It was my duty to remain calm and do my job as best as possible, until Rebecca had a chance to explain what was happening. What I can assure you is that during the time I worked with that deceased man, everything that happened defied the norm. I even thought it was a joke, as he moved almost as if he were alive. Although, little by little, he calmed down while Rebecca spoke to him in a kind tone, explaining each step of what we were doing and the medical reasons behind it. That young man's muscles never stiffened, even after we had been working with him for 3 hours. I know that rigor mortis can take up to 6 hours, or perhaps a little longer, but the young man's body was not only manageable, but I could also feel a certain warmth to the touch. I discreetly took his pulse a couple of times, thinking he might still be alive, but Rebecca noticed and very seriously told me, "This boy left hours ago. Don't be mistaken." I nodded slowly and continued with my work. We found some signs of recent violence, such as bruises and scratches, but nothing that would explain his death. It was a mystery. We both wondered what had happened, and suddenly a subtle whisper caught my attention. The wine. I stared at Rebecca to see if she had heard it too. Bodies can say things that sound like words and even emit sounds, but this is due to the gases that accumulate after death. However, a complete sentence was unusual. Rebecca, however, remained calm and did what was necessary to analyze the contents of her stomach. She had consumed wine hours earlier, and a more in-depth examination led us to determine the cause of his death. The boy had been poisoned with arsenic. We immediately reported that the young man on the table was the possible victim of homicide, and in just over half an hour, 2 forensic experts arrived and continued the investigation. Meanwhile, we finished the paperwork for the transfer of this young man, as they would surely take him to the forensic morgue for further analysis. After an hour, they took him away, and both Rebecca and I were finally able to return to the office. As soon as I sat down at my desk, I let out a deep sigh. My back and head ached and my hands were trembling. I stared at her, waiting for answers, and she didn't wait long to give them to me. Sometimes these things happen, Antonio. You have to get used to it. I tried to inquire a little more, but Rebecca couldn't give me a clinical explanation of what had happened. She only told me that sometimes the deceased arrive very agitated, perhaps because of the violence of their deaths, because of how unexpected they were, or on the contrary, because they knew what was coming and they couldn't help it. In those cases, the deceased's body appears more agitated or rigid than usual, and it's something she had to learn to deal with. Whispering to them, speaking calmly, usually helps a lot in those cases. She doesn't know why, but it does. I paused to think about those words, and I couldn't help but think that it all had a supernatural origin. I knew Rebecca was an atheist, and it confused me quite a bit that, having witnessed something like this on more than one occasion, she remained so skeptical. I asked her if she didn't think it was a sign of something spiritual, something beyond our earthly realm, and she replied with something I'll never forget. "You can interpret these situations however you like, Antonio. What matters is that you do your job well, and that you help the people who lie in that room to make a quick transition. Or, like today, help them find answers and achieve justice." I understood perfectly what she meant, and we continued working together. Without a doubt, the best mentor I've ever had. I had. And as for the young man, I didn't know what happened to him until several months later, when the forensic experts visited us regarding the death of a young man from a gunshot wound. I took the opportunity to approach one of them and asked him about that case. I noticed the confusion in his eyes, but after a while, after refreshing his memory, he remembered the case and told me what happened. The deceased had inherited his parents' apartment. Of the immediate family, only he and his younger brother remained, but since his younger brother was very wayward and still a minor, his parents decided to leave him nothing so he wouldn't squander it. His older brother tried to help him, but it was impossible, and all he did was demand what was rightfully his. These fights led him to harbor a lot of resentment toward his older brother, and the desire to take the entire inheritance drove him to plot his brother's death. He knew that if he murdered him with a firearm, it would be obvious that it was him, so he came up with the idea of poisoning his brother. He spoke with some friends from the street, and they advised him to use arsenic. They told him where to find it, and sooner rather than later he managed to poison a glass of wine his brother was drinking with his girlfriend. He confessed shortly afterward, when he finally became aware of the horror of his actions. I can only imagine how terrible that young man's death must have been. Sick, but knowing deep down that something was wrong, that it was too much of a coincidence. I hope his soul is resting in peace. Since then, I've experienced a couple of similar cases. Although Rebecca went to another country, what I learned from her helped me a lot. Now I stay calm, and I help the deceased as much as I can. I've even made it a habit to speak in a low voice, to keep the souls company as they cling to their bodies, on their journey to the afterlife. My name is Leo, and I work in the archives of the city coroner's office. My job is to organize case files, autopsy reports, and evidence logs after investigations are closed. It's a quiet job, mostly spent in a basement storage room filled with rows of steel shelves and cardboard boxes that smell of old paper and dust. I preferred it that way. No interaction with the public, no new bodies, just the silent, settled dead on paper. That changed last winter. It started with the cold. The archive has no external windows and the climate control is constant, but I began to feel a deep, persistent chill in one specific aisle. Row 7, Shelf C. The cases there were from the late 1980s to early 1990s. At first I ignored it, thinking it was a draft, but the chill followed me. I'd feel it on the back of my neck while working at my desk 20 feet away. One afternoon, I was reshelving a box from 1989. It was a standard case, a John Doe found in the river, death by drowning. As I slid the box onto Shelf C in row 7, my hand brushed against a file that was sticking out. It wasn't labeled like the others. The tab simply read, Estate Sale, Lot Number 42. Puzzled, I pulled it out. It wasn't a coroner's file at all, but a slim dossier from a public trustee's office, detailing the contents of an estate sold off after an old woman died with no heirs. Lists of furniture, books, and trinkets. Paperclipped to the last page was a faded Polaroid of a handsome, ornate wooden chest, carved with intricate, swirling patterns. The moment I touched the Polaroid, the single fluorescent light above row 7 flickered and died. The chill became so intense I could see my breath. From the darkness at the end of the row, I heard a clear, dry rustling sound, like pages being slowly turned one by one. There were no pages back there, only boxes. I froze, the file in my hand feeling suddenly heavy and wrong. The rustling stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 like a fingernail gently testing wood. I shoved the file back into the nearest box and practically ran to the circuit breaker. When I restored the light, the aisle was empty and silent, but the cold remained. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by the morbid nature of my workplace. But the next day, the file was on my desk. Not the whole box, just the estate sale file, lying squarely in the center of my blotter. No one else had a key. I decided to investigate, thinking if I understood it, the phenomenon might stop. The file noted the chest was purchased from the estate sale by a man named Carl Riggs. A quick search of our digital database, which only goes back to 1995, showed a Carl Riggs was indeed a case. He was a recluse found deceased in his home in 1998. The cause was ruled accidental due to a fall, but the notes were sparse, the investigation perfunctory. The evidence log listed items seized from his home. Item number 14 was wooden chest, ornate. It was signed out to the evidence warehouse a week after Riggs' death. There was no record of it being signed back in or destroyed. That's when the whispers started. Not voices exactly. More like the distant echo of someone reading aloud in a monotone, just on the edge of hearing. It always came from row 7. I began to notice other things. Papers on my desk would be ever so slightly rearranged. A pencil would roll off a shelf by itself. The cold spot began to move, drifting out of the aisle and lingering near my chair. I knew I had to find that chest. It was the only tangible link. The evidence warehouse is a separate, crumbling building on the edge of the city complex. After some awkward persuasion and leveraging of old favors, a warehouse manager let me in to look for the old Riggs evidence box. We found it on a high shelf, covered in grime. He left me to it. Inside, beneath some moldy clothing and a few rusted tools, was the chest from the Polaroid. It was smaller than I imagined, the dark wood gleaming dully under the warehouse lights. The carvings weren't just patterns. On closer look, they were minute, interlocking faces, their expressions a mix of sorrow and silent screaming. The chest was locked, with no visible keyhole. As I reached to touch it, a wave of nauseating despair hit me, a feeling of profound, eternal loneliness. I pulled my hand back. The whispering was in my head now, no longer distant. It was a man's voice, Carl Riggs' voice perhaps, repeating a single phrase. "It's not full. It needs to be full." I didn't touch the chest again. I closed the evidence box, reported it as mistakenly stored past its destruction date, and formally recommended its disposal. The bureaucracy moved slowly, but eventually a work order was issued. I made sure I was there the day the incinerator truck came for the condemned evidence. I watched from my office window as the box containing the chest was loaded and driven away. The archives were quiet after that. The chill in row 7 faded. The whispers stopped. For a month, I thought it was over. Then, last Tuesday, a new batch of files arrived from a recent case. A schoolteacher had died peacefully in her sleep. Among the personal effects sent over with the paperwork was a familiar-looking small wooden jewelry box her family wanted donated. It was on my desk, waiting for me to log it into the property system. The carving was simpler, but the style was unmistakable. The same swirling, consuming pattern. As I stared at it, the lid trembled slightly, and a faint, dry rustle, like old parchment, sighed from within. I didn't open it. I wrapped it in a plastic bag, filled out the disposal forms myself, and walked it down to the incinerator chute. As the bag vanished into the darkness, I heard it. Not a rustle, but a faint, frustrated tap, tap, tap from inside the bag, fading as it fell. Now, I dread new arrivals. I examine every item, every box. I know the chest was destroyed. But the pattern, the feeling, it wasn't unique. It was a design. And somewhere in an attic, at a flea market, or in someone's loving home, another one is waiting. It's not full, and it needs to be.